One thing I've noticed about my kids is that they are always in a hurry to grow up. And I've noticed it in a lot of things they do, but most recently, my family's been learning to do pottery together. And Noah, my son, he got a pottery wheel from his homeschool. And I did a little bit of the pottery wheel in high school. And so I've been trying to teach him how to use it. And every time he wants to sit at the wheel and he wants to just do it all by himself. But 2 minutes later, the clay is just smushed and he is frustrated and he says, I don't want to do this anymore. Over and over again, I'm offering him help, but he just wants to be able to do it by himself. Somehow he thinks he doesn't need practice. Somehow he thinks that he doesn't need a teacher to teach him. Somehow he thinks that he'll be instantly good at it. And it's so easy to point out in my son or in my children, but if I'm honest, I'm not much different, am I? I want to see results and I want them now. I want God to use me and I want him to do it now. I want answers from him and I want them now. You see where I'm going with this? But if I'm really honest, I notice that my impatient tendency is actually pointing to something far deeper, a deeper fear that I actually have, where I'm wondering, am I actually ready to be used by him? Have I learned enough things? Am I gifted enough? Or have I just failed too much? Have I just messed up too much? Should God maybe just use someone else? Maybe you resonate with that this morning. And so this morning, as we look at the life of Moses, we're going to answer a simple question. What do you do when you don't feel ready to be used by God? You see, this morning, we're in our 6th week of the series titled From Eden to Jesus that we're walking through this summer. And it's a journey through the Old Testament stories that shape our faith and reveal God's redemptive plan. And we're discovering together how the Bible is one connected story of God's love, rescue, and an invitation for us still today. Last week, as we met together, we looked at the story of Joseph, and we closed the book of Genesis. And as we did, we saw that Abraham's family has grown into a large nation, the Israelites. God has preserved them through even the difficulty of famine. And this week, we turn to Exodus chapter 2 as we encounter another one of Abraham's descendants, Moses. And as we journey through the first half of Moses' story today, we're going to uncover 3 truths as we go through our scripture. The first is this, that God prepares those he chooses. The second is that God's calling is sustained by his presence, not our abilities. And then thirdly, that God delivers those who place their trust in him. Our text we'll be reading today will begin in Exodus chapter 2, starting at verse 11. So if you brought your Bibles, you can turn there with me and we'll read it all together. If not, it'll be available on the screens beside me. But Joseph, whom we studied last week, he stayed in Egypt until his death at 110. But on his deathbed, he told his brothers and his descendants that God will eventually take his people back out of Egypt, and he will bring them to the land that he promised to give his ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And this foretelling at the end of Genesis sets the stage for the opening of Exodus, where God is going to now finally deliver his people out of Egypt into the land that he had promised to give them. And the book of Exodus opens after Joseph and all his brothers have died. God has been faithful in preserving them. They have been fruitful. They have multiplied even in a foreign land of Egypt. But a problem now arises. A new king, a new Pharaoh, he rises to power, and he does not know Joseph. And he fears that God's people, the Israelites, have grown too big. And they're so big that they could retaliate. So he acts harshly towards them. But despite the more he starts to oppress those people, they continue to multiply. And so he gets frustrated by this, and the new Pharaoh, he gives an order that every Hebrew child that is born a boy must be killed by being thrown into the Nile River. And this is the situation into which Moses is born into. And we just read Moses' birth in Exodus chapter 2. And Moses is born against all odds. His mother was a Levite, and in lieu of Pharaoh's decree, she was able to hide him for 3 months. And then she couldn't hide him any longer. So she decides to put him into the Nile River. He's supposed to toss him into the Nile River, but instead she was able to create an ark for him, a basket that would preserve his life and keep him alive. And the baby with the basket, in the basket, floats by Pharaoh's daughter. And while she should have just let him pass by and eventually die, her heart was drawn towards compassion. She drew him out of the water. And then she found a Hebrew woman to nurse the baby who just so happened to be that baby's mother. This baby boy was raised in Pharaoh's household, given the name Moses. And you can see the irony at play in this passage. Pharaoh had an intent to kill all of the Hebrew babies by having them thrown into the Nile, but it's this very decree that brings Moses into his own household, not just to be preserved, but eventually he will be raised up to deliver his people from Pharaoh's oppressive hand. See, God is able to bring deliverance even from the destruction and the chaos going on in Egypt from Pharaoh's decree. That same word used to describe the basket that Noah was put in is the same word described as the ark that Noah preserved his family in. And by doing this, the author is foreshadowing God is going to rescue and deliver his people from Egypt through the water. But this time, he's preserving his people not just through a boat, but through a person. Moses will be now the vehicle through whom God is going to deliver his people. And Moses, he survives his birth against all odds. He's another miracle baby. We've seen a few of these in our Old Testament scriptures so far. And the one that comes to mind is Abraham and Sarah, how they were given a child in their old age. It was a miracle to them, and here we are, another baby who has a miraculous birth. And the same way, these miraculous births are going to foreshadow one that is to come, which is Jesus, who was born against all odds when he is conceived in a virgin. And not only is this just a recurring theme throughout Scripture, but also shows that God is setting the stage for something great that is about to come in our story. So I want to pick back up the text in verse 11 of chapter 2 as we read a little bit about Moses and the man he becomes. It says this: one day after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his people were and watched them at their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Looking this way and that and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. The next day he went out and saw two Hebrews fighting. He asked the one in the wrong, "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" And the man said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, "What I did must have become known." When Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian, where he sat down by a well. Now a priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came to draw water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. Some shepherds came along and drove them away, but Moses got up and came to their rescue and watered their flock. When the girls returned to Reuel, their father, he asked them, "Why have you returned so early today?" And they answered, "An Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flock." "And where is he?" Reuel asked his daughters. "Why did you leave him? Invite him to have something to eat." Moses agreed to stay with the man, who gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses in marriage. Zipporah gave birth to a son, and Moses named him Gershom, saying, "I have become a foreigner in a foreign land." And during that long period, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. Moses grew up in an Egyptian household, and biblical tradition tells us that he was about 40 years old when the situation of killing the Egyptian occurred. So what just took place, the scene that we just read, Moses is no longer a kid anymore. And Moses, he had grown up watching hard labor and oppression on the Israelite people, and one day, he just can't take it anymore. And so he decides to take matters into his own hands, and he kills the Egyptian. Moses treats the Egyptian slave with the same injustice that he has learned from Pharaoh, who is having so much oppression towards the Israelites. And it's pointing to the prophetic way that God is going to deal with the Egyptians the way that they have been dealing with God's people. And Moses was compelled by the right thing. He wanted justice. He wanted to stand up for his people because they were being oppressed, but he went about it the wrong way. He tried to enact justice on his own power. Moses is clearly bent towards justice, but his reaction causes him trouble. And when Moses' actions have been found out, Pharaoh wants to kill him, but Moses runs away to a foreign land. But God is still with him. Because Moses finds a well there, and there just happened to be the daughters of the priest of Midian. He waters their flock. He was invited back with them. He stays in Midian, and he starts to build his new life there. He marries Zipporah. He has a son. Verse 23 describes this as a long period, and biblical tradition tells us this was another season of 40 years of his life. All the while, his people were crying out because of the oppression they were experiencing in Egypt. And so what we see in this portion of the text is that God is at work. God preserved Moses during his birth. He brought him up out of Egypt and raised him up in Egypt. He gave him a front row seat to the oppression that was being afflicted upon God's people. And God was even there with him when he had to flee and provided him with a sanctuary in which he could take refuge. In other words, God was preparing Moses before Moses ever knew it. See, before God used Moses publicly, he spent decades preparing him in his heart privately. So this passage is revealing to us that God prepares those he chooses, which means that our unique upbringings, the difficulty we have faced in life, even our failures, can become God's preparation for what he might want to do through us. Oftentimes, I don't think we see our story that way. Oftentimes, we see our difficult upbringing, we see the mistakes that we have made not as God's preparation, but actually maybe as our disqualification. We often think that God must not want to use me because he let me have such a poor hand dealt to me when I was younger. But this section of Moses' story reveals that God uses both good and bad situations to shape Moses, and he can do the same in your life. So it may be that you came and you were born into an unbelieving home. Well, so was Moses. It may be that you were born on the wrong side of an oppressive family. Well, so was Moses. See, over and over again, God is revealing himself as someone who is stronger than the chaos of our life experiences. God is bigger than the difficulty we've been dealt, and he can even use it and orchestrate it to build and shape the people he has chosen. See, the fact that God uses Moses is a beautiful reminder that he can and will use us as well. And Moses isn't without his faults. His reaction to the oppression he witnessed was to kill. He sought justice by taking matters into his own hands, but even his failures did not disqualify him from still being used. God was able to use it as a part of his preparation. God preserved him as a baby, raised him in Pharaoh's household. He was given honor and privilege for those first 40 years of life, and then God will use the next 40 years as he fled to Egypt to teach Moses humility, to show him that God can only use someone who is dependent upon God's strength and not their own. Some of us, as we hear this story, it's starting to resonate with us. Because some of us, I believe, might still be holding on to our past, thinking that somehow we have been disqualified from being used because of our upbringing. Or maybe you've encountered a bump on your journey of life that seems like it's just taken you off course. Maybe you made a mistake that changed the trajectory of your life and you don't feel like you can ever bring it back. My hope and my prayer is that through Moses' story, you are reminded this morning that God can and still use even that situation to shape you into the person he wants you to be. I personally resonate with Moses' season in the wilderness. Feeling like a foreigner in a foreign land. A lot of my journey, I felt like I was moving from place to place without a home. I switched schools in both the middle of junior high and the middle of high school. I remember being the only one to enter in the first year of college in my department. I remember being displaced from my home church when there wasn't a position available for me to come on staff. I had seasons in my life where I felt like I was displaced, and I concluded that maybe just God doesn't want to use me. And I lived that way for a lot of my life. But there was a season where I was feeling displaced, where God brought a mentor into my life during one of those seasons, and he encouraged me to reflect on what God was preparing in me through each of those situations. And he gave me about 2 weeks to spend time mapping out my faith journey with all the difficulties, with all the bumps on the roads, with all the failures, to write it all down and then pray and seek the Lord on where he was present in each of those situations. To find the ways where he was molding and shaping me the whole way through. And this exercise helped me redeem those areas where I thought God was absent in my life, where I thought he was disqualifying me from the ways he wanted to use me, and instead I started to see how he was actually preparing me for what was ahead. And it became one of the most transformative parts of my faith journey. And so I want to ask you this morning, what areas of your past are you still holding on to? What part of your story have you written off as wasted? And how might God actually have been using that situation to prepare you? I don't know if I got the grammar right on that, but you know what I'm getting at. See, sometimes people think that being a Christian means we're spared from difficulty, but that isn't the case. Moses still had trouble even though he was called by God, being prepared by God. Sometimes God may spare us from difficulty, but I think most of the time he actually wants to use it. Oftentimes, I think he is less interested in the situation that is actually happening, and he's more interested in how you are going to choose to face it. Are you going to choose to lean into him? Will you let him be your strength and your guide, or are you going to choose frustration? Are you going to try and continue to pave your own path? What we see in Moses' story is that paving your own path often leads to more trouble. That's when Moses had to flee, go to a foreign land. But even there, God was with him. He was providing for him, and he was teaching him valuable lessons that will prepare him for the call he would place on his life. So I want to pick back up the text in chapter 3, verse 1, as we see God call Moses. Verse 1, it says this. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. And when the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them cry out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of the land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me. And I've seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them, so now go, I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God said, I will be with you. And this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. Moses said to God, suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your father has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? Then what shall I tell them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites, I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever. The name shall call me from generation to generation. God tells Moses to go to the elders of Israel, to tell them God has appeared to Moses and told them that he has seen the oppression in Egypt and will bring them out of their misery to a land flowing with milk and honey. And God tells Moses that you will not leave empty-handed, but the Egyptians will give you silver, gold, and clothing. And even after hearing God's promise, Moses still wants to unqualify himself. And in chapter 4, he gives the reason. And his next reason is that I am slow of speech and tongue. But God in chapter 4 reminds him that he made his tongue, and therefore he will be with his tongue. Moses insists still that someone else should be sent, and God allows him to bring his brother Aaron with him to be his mouthpiece. God then gives Moses 3 signs to perform in front of Pharaoh to show God's power is at work through him, and then to go before him and ask him to let his people go and worship. So Moses and Aaron, they approach Pharaoh. They show the signs that God has given them. Moses takes his staff, he turns it into a snake, and Pharaoh isn't impressed. Moses pulls his hand out of his cloak, it's diseased, he puts it back in, he pulls it back out again, and it's completely healed, but Pharaoh still is resistant. Moses then takes water and he turns it into blood in front of them, but Pharaoh's heart is still closed off. Even more so, Pharaoh is enraged by Moses' request to release his people, and what he decides to do is oppress the Israelites even more. This failed attempt at deliverance makes the Israelites even more discouraged. And what they choose to do is they choose to blame Moses because he's the one who made their lives even more difficult. In this portion of Moses' story, Moses has been preserved. And not only that, he is now being called to be used by God. God calls to Moses through the burning bush. He speaks to Moses. He reveals his plans. He says, you, the outcast Moses, you are going to bring God's people up out of Egypt. Moses, you are going to be the means by which I'm going to do this powerful work. But Moses responds with trepidation. He is hesitant. He doesn't think he's fit for the task. And the whole conversation, Moses is focused on himself, asking, why me? All throughout the conversation, he continues to focus on the ways that he himself is inadequate. But God keeps reminding him that he is only qualified because I will be with you. It's God's power that is going to be your strength. We miss in our English translation the Hebrew wordplay that's going on, but Moses' reason to be disqualified is because he feels his I is inadequate. I am not worthy of it. I am not good enough. But God's response is constantly, but I will be with you. I will go there. I will be displays my power. Moses keeps evaluating God's call through the lens of his limitations instead of evaluating his limitations through the lens of God's presence. Moses says, who am I? What if they don't believe me? What if I can't speak? Send someone else. I don't want to do this. But then, after lots of conversation, Moses finally goes because he has someone go with him, with Aaron. And what he experiences is rejection. Pharaoh rejects him. Then the Israelites reject him. Moses faces real discouragement, because he is blamed for all the added difficulty that comes when his attempt at deliverance doesn't work. But even through that whole situation, all of the conversation, God's power is never questioned, only Moses' ability. Moses is discouraged and he argues because he feels he is inadequate. But God is the one who is adequate. So I believe what this portion of the text is actually telling us this morning is that God's calling is sustained by his presence, not our ability. We have a tendency to act like Moses, don't we? We stare at our shortcomings all day long. We find all of the ways that we are disqualified from God's calling. But God is not looking for the qualified. He's looking to qualify the called. And each of us sitting in this room this morning, we have been called just like Moses has. We have been called out of our sinful lives to live as ambassadors of God's kingdom here on earth. Everyone who has heard the good news of Jesus is called to that kind of life. And while we have a tendency to stare at our shortcomings, all of our failures, all of our inadequacies, God is patiently reminding us it's not about your ability. It's about my strength working in and through you. Which is why Paul so confidently says in 2 Corinthians 12:9, I boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses so that Christ's power may rest on me. God is honored even more through our weaknesses and our unqualifications. So this morning, I encourage you, stop letting your inadequacies define you, because God is greater than your inadequacies. God is greater than your lack of experience. God is greater than talent. His mighty power can work through whomever he has called. And our success to live out the calling he has placed in our lives is not dependent on our ability, but his power. All that being said, God's call doesn't prevent us from experiencing discouragement, though. We see that in Moses. God literally tells Moses after calling him that, hey, the calling I just gave you, it's going to be really hard. And then it gets really hard. And Moses acts surprised, like, why is this so hard? And rightfully so, right? God warned him that Pharaoh is going to reject him, but he was not prepared for the hurt feelings he would experience when his own people reject him. That would be truly discouraging. And I think oftentimes we aren't prepared for that discouragement in our lives either, because God invites us to follow him, but after that, it seems like things just get harder. The mistake would be to conclude that we are missing out on God, that he's no longer with us. And some of you faced discouragement because you became a Christian and things got harder. Maybe you came to faith and it meant you were rejected from your family or your friend group that you once belonged to. Maybe you tried to live out God's calling in your life and be a light to others, to share your faith with a coworker, someone in your family, maybe even your spouse, and it just did not go well. Those situations are really discouraging. But I just want to clarify this morning, God didn't tell us we wouldn't face discouragement. He didn't say we wouldn't face rejection. He didn't say that everything would be easy for those who have to follow him. In fact, Jesus reassures his disciples that they should not be surprised when things get harder. Jesus says in John 16, verse 33, in this world you will have trouble, but take heart, because I have overcome the world. Things may get harder for those whom God calls, but that's not a reason for us to lose hope. As God's plan is still unfolding, sometimes we just need to be patient and continue to rely on Christ's strength. I got more on this point too. God's presence also doesn't guarantee immediate results. And I want to remind you that in Moses' life, God spent 40 years preparing him in the unknown ways in Egypt. And God spent another 40 years teaching him humility and dependence while he was living and building his life in the wilderness. And as he takes more steps forward to be obedient to God's call, he's also going to face rejection 10 more times. He's going to be chased down to what looks like an ultimate defeat. And he's going to stand alone as the one person who actually believes that God is going to bring him victory. Rejection is hard to take, but God is just beginning. He will use every situation to shape us for his plans and his purposes. So don't let rejection, missteps, or expectations throw you from the larger work that God is doing in your life. Instead, I encourage you, wait patiently on the Lord. Draw ever near to him. And whenever you experience discouragement or rejection, let him be your teacher. Let him be your strength in those moments. Now, we can pick back up the text and see how God delivers his people, even through the stubbornness of Pharaoh. So I'm going to go ahead and summarize what happens next. There's a ton of scripture to read. So Moses and Aaron, they approach Pharaoh with the signs from God, and Pharaoh is not repentant. He's not letting them go. But God is still not done. He will deliver his people and show the Egyptians who he is. So Moses and Aaron repeatedly confront Pharaoh with God's command, let my people go, but Pharaoh's heart remains hard. And in response, God sends the 10 plagues that demonstrate his power over Egypt and its gods. He turns the Nile to blood. He sends frogs, gnats, flies, disease, boils, hail, locusts, darkness, and finally the death of every firstborn in Egypt. And each plague exposes the emptiness of Pharaoh's power and reveals that God of Israel alone is Lord over all of creation. Even after witnessing these mighty acts, Pharaoh continues to resist until the final plague finally breaks his grip. Before the final judgment, God instructs every Israelite family to sacrifice a spotless lamb and spread its blood over the doorposts of their homes. And that night, when the Lord passes through Egypt, he passes over every house marked by blood, sparing those inside while judgment fell on everyone else. Pharaoh finally releases the Israelites, and they depart in freedom. That Passover night became Israel's defining reminder that they were not saved because of their own strength or because of their own goodness, but because God provided a substitute. And that evening points forward to Jesus, who will eventually be the true Passover lamb, whose blood delivers us from sin and death and leads us into a new life of freedom. You see, in all of this, we are seeing more and more that it's God's power being revealed. Moses could never do what God called him to do. Only God's power is working through him. But even after Pharaoh let them go, his heart changed once again. And he gathered his army. He pursued Israel to the edge of the Red Sea. And what looked like freedom quickly turned into another impossible situation. But God, who delivered them and got them this far, is about to show that he could deliver them no matter the obstacle that comes their way. And now finally Moses is starting to get it. And in chapter 14, verse 13, Moses addresses the people and he says, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm and you will see the deliverance of the Lord. The Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You only need to be still." Moses has faith that God is going to be faithful to his word to deliver his people. And then victory happens. Picking up the text in verse 21, "Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and on their left. The Egyptians pursued them, and all Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen followed them into the sea. During the last watch of the night, the Lord looked down from the pillar of fire and cloud at the Egyptian army and threw it into confusion. He jammed the wheels of the chariots so they had difficulty driving. And the Egyptians said, 'Let's get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt.' Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Stretch out your hand over the sea so that the waters may flow back over the Egyptians and their chariots and horsemen.' Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak the sea went back to its place. The Egyptians were fleeing toward it, and the Lord swept them into the sea. The water flowed back and covered the chariots and horsemen. The entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea, not one of them survived. But the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and on their left. That day the Lord saved Israel from the hands of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore. And when the Israelites saw the mighty hand of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and in Moses, his servant." It takes 10 increasingly difficult plagues until Pharaoh finally submits to God's power. And all of those plagues were targeted at different Egyptian gods, challenging the entirety of the Egyptians' worldview. And that final plague is the most brutal and becomes a significant event in the lives of God's people. That Passover event is remembered in all generations. It ultimately points towards Jesus, like we already talked about. And as the Israelites depart, they plunder Egypt. They get their gold, they get clothing, they get things that they need for their journey. But Pharaoh, in his grief, having lost everything, he comes back and tries to catch them again. He corners them at the Red Sea. The Israelites see their innocent death, but Moses sees an opportunity for God to reveal himself yet again, and he does so through that parting of the Red Sea. This is the story of the great Exodus. God's people were delivered from their oppression in Egypt, but it's not just a story about liberation. It's about God's salvation. The Israelites weren't saved by the power of their own strength, but by a God who continued to provide a way for them. So I believe this portion of the text is revealing to us that God delivers those who choose to place their trust in him. See, it is God who ultimately wins the battles we face on our behalf. He defeats those forces of chaos and destruction that try to harm us. Moses and the Israelites were facing oppression in Egypt, but no matter the situation we are facing, we can remember victory has already been given to us through Christ. Colossians chapter 2, verse 15 puts it this way. "And having disarmed the powers and authority, he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them by the cross." You may find yourself in your life right now battling against situations you can't beat on your own. Maybe you resonate with Moses, where you've been trying to defeat enemies on your own power, and it works for a moment, but it leads to more difficulty along the way. All of us, as this passage exposes, are in need of someone greater to help us overcome the destruction and the chaos the world brings because of its sin. In Exodus, in this story, the Israelites and Moses, it reveals that they could not deliver themselves. But God came through at just the right moment, and he is the one who saved them. And in the same way, Jesus came to deliver us from our bondage to sin. In his ministry, Jesus showed that he was pushing back against the evil forces of this world. Miracle after miracle, he is showing that God is more powerful than the forces of this world. And Jesus lived a perfect life. He was without sin. And it was his sacrifice that was the ultimate sacrifice through which the entire world can be saved. Jesus' death and resurrection prove he's victorious over death. And there's power in Jesus. His promises are true, and we can trust that he truly is the way through which we can experience salvation. See, that gift of salvation has been made available for anyone who chooses to put their faith in him, and God is good to deliver. See, we started this morning talking about the deeper fear that resides under our impatience. We wonder if we are good enough to be used by God. And what we have seen through Moses' story this morning is that the God who calls you is the God who goes with you. And the God who goes with you is powerful enough to accomplish what he promises. Maybe today you walked in this morning feeling forgotten. Maybe you felt unqualified. Maybe you feel like you failed too many times to be used. Would Moses' story remind you that none of those things should get the final word? None of those thoughts should have a hold on you, because God prepares, God calls, God delivers, and the greatest proof of that isn't just Moses, it's Jesus. Jesus entered into our broken world, lived a life we couldn't live, and became the true Passover lamb, defeating sin and death through the cross and resurrection. And that same God who prepared Moses is preparing you. The same God who called Moses is calling you, and the same God who delivered Israel is still delivering people today through Jesus.